All right, and we are live. Hello there, everybody. This is William of Applied Virtue, back with a great interview, the long awaited sequel to our previous interview on canon in fiction, which was rudely interrupted by the weather last month. And as a result, we couldn't come to any kind of satisfying conclusion. So here with me today, remedying that, is Christopher Lansdown of Missing the Mark. Say hello there, Christopher.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
You know, it's kind of strange because you are actually the very first repeat guest on my channel.
Huh.
Strange how that
Cool.
works.
Yeah.
So anyway, if I if I remember correctly, when we last left off, and mind you, it's been a month, so I haven't really finished rewatching last month's video, so forgive me if we tread old ground here. Uh, I think what we were talking about was the kind of canon, and by canon we meant we came to understand it as, you know, when we say two works are part of the same canon, we mean that the events of each story are assumed to have happened within the universe that the story takes place. Is that right?
Yes. That basically came to be our working definition. That when you're interpreting a work, that the other work is considered to have happened within the. It is considered for the purposes of interpretation to have happened in the make-believe world. Although there is a very interesting thing which comes up about this that we're just about to talk about when we were interrupted, and that gets to the curious thing that this is not symmetric. That when an author writes, say, a series of books, that in book one, he cannot really, given the limitations of human beings, make book three, which does not exist yet and has not been written, and thus he cannot know what the contents of book three are in specific, part of the canon of book one, for the simple reason that it doesn't even exist at the time that he's writing book one. So this applies now, since our motivating example really is Star Wars. And Star Wars is an even more extreme example of this, because there is, you can modify what I said by the author having planned out the contents of all three books prior to writing any of them. And it can be argued, although I've heard people quibble on this, whether or not George Lucas really did write out the plot of all three of the original Star Wars movies prior to writing out writing the script for any one of them. He absolutely, in no way, shape, or form, had included movies that were not written by him and would not be written by him for 30 years later on as part of the story that he was writing at the time.
I heard from fans that, in fact, he had a completely different idea of what episodes 6 through 9 would be like, that differed from what actually became canon later on because of Kathleen Kennedy and the rest of that crew.
Yes, well, she famously, really bizarrely too, by the way, specifically did not have a plan for all three movies. And her plan was that for each movie she would get a separate writer-director who would just do whatever they wanted and would leave things wherever they wanted with no particular notion of what the next writer-director would do. Which, that's a plan of literally dubious sanity. I truly, she explicitly said this was her plan, and I do, in a serious, not joking sense, question the sanity of a person whose plan for a trilogy of movies is to not plan them out in any way whatsoever and just sort of see what happens. Anyway, that little tidbit aside, this is and this kind of gets to the heart of what was motivating my original video. And the real question at hand that I entirely 100% agree that when you watch Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Doesn't Awaken, that you are supposed to take episodes 1 through 6 as having happened. And here, when The Force doesn't awaken in Episode 7, for some reason the last 3 were all named for what didn't happen in the movie, that those first 6 movies are meant to be something you have in mind as the backstory for the entire universe. That I don't think anyone would argue with. I don't think anyone would in any way quibble with whether or not the original 6 movies are meant to be used to interpret the 7th movie. But I think the thing at hand, and what this gets to in the temporal aspect of this, is that making Episode 7 part of the interpretation of Episode 4, for example, is a thing which Episode 7 wasn't written by George Lucas. Episode 7 was absolutely not in the mind of George Lucas at the time he was writing Episode 4. So to claim that one must, when interpreting Episode 4, consider the later events of Episode 7 to be the trajectory of where all of this is leading is, I think, very hard to defend.
That asymmetry is actually a good point, because my argument for canon relies in large part on this kind of semantic interpretation that you couldn't really make sense of Episode 6 unless you understand that Episodes 4 and 5 occurred before it, and you couldn't make sense of episode, say, the prequel trilogy unless you know that they are the prequels to what was written before, that is Episodes 4 through 6. But that said, wouldn't you say that if you have leaving aside something that might not add a positive to the canon, like for instance the sequel trilogy, wouldn't you say that now that we have these prequels, say what you will about the prequels, I personally think that having the prequels in mind and then going into the original trilogy adds another dimension to the original trilogy that wasn't there before. Would you not agree with that?
That's an interesting question. There's a related thing I just want to mention as kind of a curious thought experiment, which is not for me an actual thought experiment. I have children, and my oldest son, who's 11, is at an age where he's starting to watch movies, and I've shown him Star Wars episodes 4. I think I've shown him 4. At some point a little bit later, I'm going to show him 5 and 6. Now, there's an interesting question. Am I going to bother ever showing him Star Wars episodes 1, 2, and 3? And relatedly, if I don't, when he's on his own, or otherwise under the direction of his own time, will he ever bother to look these things up? And will he bother to see them? So there's an interesting thought experiment here, because for us who have already seen all these things, there's just the question of how do we interpret it. But there's another thing directly related, which I'm mentioning just as a thought experiment, and then I'll address your question in a second, of would a person who hasn't seen these movies yet, there's an excellent reason to watch episodes 4, 5, and 6. Would they really spend the time and money on episodes 1, 2, and 3? And could you imagine anybody at any time from here on out spending any money or time on episodes 7, 8, and 9? So, and if you never watch the movies, then obviously you can't be obligated to consider them in your artistic interpretation of the movies you have seen, since you can't do that for movies you haven't. Anyway, so that's a thought experiment, just sort of keeping the back of one's mind, I think. To answer your question about I guess there are 2 shades of it. One of them that the episodes 1, 2, and 3. To what degree do they actually enrich the world, enrich the stories of episodes 4, 5, and 6? If you watch 4, 5, and 6 in light of 1, 2, and 3, and I mean, to some degree, I guess there are two. There's three main characters who could really be enriched in that, and they would be, or no, I'm sorry, four. There's Darth Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, and the Emperor. And the of those four, I would say that really it's the Emperor, I think, that has the most that really sort of expands, because he's the only one of those four where his character in the original trilogy really seems to have much to do with his character in the later trilogy. Darth Vader kind of just completely changes right at the end of the sequel of the prequel trilogy. And so there isn't much of a continuity between the character that he had and what came later. Although I will say, you could certainly argue that it fleshes out in one particular way, a thing that you could in your own imagination flesh out yourself, of when Darth Vader repents at the end of Return of the Jedi, that having seen Anakin Skywalker being good prior to when he really, and I'm talking episode 1, the part where Qui-Gon Jinn remarks that Anakin is very generous, that he gives without thought of repayment, that there is that thread. Then that's the fleshing out of when Darth Vader repents, that's what he is going back to, that is his true self, the virtue that had been buried for so long, that he is rediscovering, that is constitutive of his humanity. So now, at the same time, you could also imagine all sorts of things that do that, but I will say it certainly fleshes it out in a particular way that adds something. The Emperor is the one, I think, because the characters of Obi-Wan are, I mean, they to the degree to which the prequel sets up the Obi-Wan of the original movies is, I think, very arguable. And Yoda, he wasn't very fleshed out as a character in the prequel movies, so I don't know that it adds very much, other than that he was a fairly great warrior. So I mean, we saw some evidence of that claim, that when Luke said he was looking for a great warrior named Yoda. So I mean, I would say arguably that does flesh it out a little bit, not very much though. And then the character of the Emperor is really the one most fleshed out, I would say, and he is most consistent because he was scheming and manipulative all throughout the prequels and also in the original movies. So there he becomes much more of a fuller and fleshed out character. And so he's not, I think... Now, the thing I would say is that this does certainly flesh them out. To greater and lesser extents, as I sort of went over.
Well, what I meant by adding another dimension is, well, let's say we look at Darth Vader, and we
Mhm.
see in Darth, and when it's sort of like, I've heard Anakin Skywalker, if you take the entire prequel trilogy, and you take the first 6 episodes of Star Wars and
Mhm.
read them as Anakin Skywalker's story, it might come across as a kind of tragedy where where Anakin rises as a great hero, and then in a kind of Macbeth style falls into darkness and becomes a vile creature, for
Mhm.
perhaps understandable reasons, but he still becomes this depraved monster by the and then later at the very end dies in the arms of his son, having seen what he had become, and ultimately deciding he didn't want that anymore at the very end.
Mhm.
So you could so if you and that's sort of the level of depth. Now, granted, I can see where you're coming from when you say that Anakin, sort of jumps around in his characterization, because each of the episodes of the prequel trilogy they have gaps of several years in between them. So between episode 1 and 2, there's 10 years of Anakin training as a Jedi Padawan, and between episodes 2 and 3, there's about three, I think, 3 years of Anakin fighting in a bloody intergalactic epic conflict. So there's going to be these kinds of changes going on. In fact, there's and because of this dynamism that isn't exactly logically connected. I mean, yes, you can see the continuity between Anakin of Episode 1, Anakin of Episode 2, and Anakin of Episode 3. There is a continuity between those three if you look at it and squint at it. But I've heard him described as kind of an empty calorie character, and that we don't really see because we don't get to see the slow build up to it. It's just it goes in jumps. It seems like the trajectory goes in these it skips over a few steps, and we don't really see the gradual build up to Darth Vader. We only see the very beginning, the sort of middle of the process, and then the very end of that process.
Well,
And
it's interesting that part of the problem is that in episode 2, which was I can barely remember the titles of these things. Attack of the Clones.
Yeah, that one.
I very nearly got it wrong, but yes, Attack of the Clones. The thing is, in that, his characterization is basically entirely he is a petulant, horny teenager. And that's it. That's all he is. That's the entirety of his characterization. He's either infatuated with Padme or whining. I mean, at one point he gets really angry and kills a whole bunch of sand people, I think. But like, he really doesn't have much in the way of characterization. He doesn't have like he doesn't have like thoughts, aspirations, dreams, a philosophy of life. He doesn't have anything really. He's just a petulant, whiny, horny teenager. And so part of the problem was that episode 2 was really a lost opportunity for characterization. I will say, okay, I think if my memory is not deceiving me, this is not just a video I have yet to do, but a video I actually did, where I defended episode 3 with the fall of Anakin Skywalker as far more realistic than it is believable. That the fundamental way he became Darth Vader was he was attracted by the Emperor, and then at a crucial moment he did an entirely defensible action, which was he defended the Emperor from a summary attack when he didn't believe the evidence was sufficient to justify the sort of summary attack going on. And then the Emperor twisted his interpretation of what happened into Anakin crossing the line. Once Anakin believed that he had already turned to the dark side, now he was psychologically able to start actually being on the dark side. Once he believed himself already, that the battle was already lost, that he had given up his virtue, that he had turned to evil, now he actually psychologically could turn to evil because he did not think there was anything left to fight for. And that indeed is how people often do fall in that sort of way, where they do a collection of morally ambiguous actions that were defensible and were defendable, but then they shift their interpretation to these actions being indefensible, at which point since they've already transgressed, there's no longer a line for them to cross, and they can very easily then, because in their imagination there is no line anymore, they're already on the other side of it. Not seeing that line, they're now psychologically able to cross it. So it was, the fall of Anakin Skywalker was really, to my mind, quite shockingly well done, in the sense of it was very psychologically true to life. It was not a very satisfying story, in part because it was true to life, and evil can never be satisfying, because evil is always a privation. Evil is a thing not being what it should, and you can't tell a bad story well. And the turn to evil is always intrinsically a bad story. So
would you say Macbeth is a bad story?
I'm sorry. When I say it's a bad story, I mean that the particulars of the fall of the character, not the telling of what happened. So when I say it's a bad story, what I mean is that the story of how the person turned can never be satisfying. Macbeth is the tragedy of Macbeth is an extremely good play. The fall of Macbeth, the decision of Macbeth to kill Duncan, is not told in a satisfying manner, because it can't be. It's, Macbeth was tempted and then he gave into it. That's not, why did he give into it? Well, you can't have a good reason for a bad decision. So there isn't a good reason that Macbeth did. You don't understand Macbeth in the sense of, oh yeah, well, anyone could have done that. Because, obviously I can see how Macbeth thought that what he was doing was good. Well, you can't, because he didn't. Macbeth didn't think he was doing good. Macbeth did as villains do. And so when I say that you can't have, it's an intrinsically bad story, I don't mean that you can't have a good story in which this happens. You obviously can. Macbeth is, I think, you picked an excellent example. What I mean is that if you look at it, Macbeth is, the tragedy of Macbeth is primarily looking at the psychological after effects and the deterioration, how, having transgressed into evil, Macbeth then, his entire life falls apart, is really what the tragedy of Macbeth is about. The actual decision of Macbeth to kill Duncan is a pretty small, it's not tiny, but it's a fairly small part of it. And it just consists of, essentially, he's really ambitious, and then he picked his wife very poorly. And so that's what I mean, that and why I think that Anakin is not satisfying, because with the story being about the fall of Anakin, not the after effects, that that you can't have a satisfying turn of a character to evil, because to be satisfying, there'd have to be a good reason for what happens. But there can't be a good reason for evil. Intrinsically, it's the nature of evil, is that you can't have a good reason for it. And so, so that is, I think, what part of why it's often so unsatisfying to people, is just because it is very psychologically realistic. But in terms of our broader topic, because I kind of was derailing us a little bit there.
Yeah, that's.
I do think that you're correct, certainly, that you have a character arc, that the first movies introduce a character arc to Anakin Skywalker. Although he already had a character. He already had half of that character arc in the sequel trilogy. And so
in the original trilogy, you mean?
Thank you. Yes, in the original trilogy. Thank you. And so what I would say there is that the prequel trilogy is an entirely legitimate addition to the. It gets a few things wrong in details. For example, Leia remembered her mother being very sad. This is a really poignant, important moment in Return of the Jedi, and in the prequel trilogy, Leia literally never met her mother because her mother died prior to even holding her infant twins in her hands. So, there are a few things they got wrong, right? But neglecting the fact that the works of men have.
might have those minor, yeah.
Yeah, they inevitably have errors in them, but neglecting that aspect, it's an entirely legitimate addition to the story. And so it doesn't fundamentally contradict anything. What I would say, though, the distinction I would draw, which gets to sort of the heart of what we've been talking about, is that while the prequels are an entirely legitimate addition to the original trilogy, I do not think that they are an artistically necessary addition to that trilogy. That you could, that the various things that those movies fill in, you can, in your mind, consider being filled in different ways, and use that to interpret the original trilogy, and be coming up with legitimate interpretations of the original trilogy. That is to say that the original trilogy does not require the prequel trilogy as it was written. And so I do not think there's anything illegitimate about the prequel trilogy. But by contrast, if you want to imagine a prequel a prequel story into the Star Wars universe where the Jedi were not absurdly incompetent, that you could imagine such, where the Jedi were defeated not because the Jedi were a collection of idiots who kind of deserved to be defeated at that point, but because the Emperor was even more clever and even more cunning and even more powerful. And that if you want to interpret Star Wars episodes 4, 5, and 6 in this manner, that the return of the Jedi is something far more optimistic than episodes 1, 2, and 3 make it. That would also be a perfectly legitimate interpretation of episodes 4, 5, and 6. And so what I would argue is you are not constrained in your interpretation of episodes 4, 5, and 6 to think the return of the Jedi is that, the galaxy is once again going to be guarded by a bunch of bumbling incompetents who happen to be really good at sword fighting.
Yeah, I mean, but then again, there is this kind of Lindy effect, and I mean, sure they might have had their off moments and definitely lose it, but the Jedi have been, according to the source material, the Jedi have been guarding the Republic for, under the watchful eye of the Jedi. The Republic has been around for
1,000 generations.
1,000 generations. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and
for 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights guarded the Republic.
Yeah, so
or the Guardians of Peace in the galaxy. I'm sorry.
It's not as though they were always incompetent. It's just, I mean, I think the prequels mention that the Jedi were, they're precognitive because of the, it might be the, I mean, the prequels were a bit, they were telling the story of an end of an era, because they were talking about, because the politics of that era showed that the Republic was hopelessly corrupted, that and because of their association with this corrupt Republic, the Jedi and their powers were waning, and they allowed themselves to be compromised in some ways, and as a result of that, that is why they fell in the first place. But so there's the, so I guess you could argue that, I mean, you could argue that having this pristine idea of what the Jedi were like before the Empire rose up and destroyed them all might make for a better story, and I'm not going to argue with you there, but it isn't as though the Jedi, it was just, it isn't just this informed weakness. It isn't just that there's this informed greatness that the Jedi have, but just wasn't on screen. The characters acknowledge that, our powers are weakening. We're not able to make as wise decisions anymore because the Force is our ability to see the future, our ability to judge things accurately has been clouded, and so that's it, and that is a large part of this narrative, and
Mm.
arguably a lot of the sort of extra materials, the extended universe that has come out since the prequels, has expanded on this in a lot of different ways, explored this in a lot of different angles. Like there was this one comic that I remember reading about that had, how there was this common fan complaint. There's a common fan complaint about the Jedi's practice of taking children when they're very young and separating them from their parents and raising them as in a sort of monk-like existence.
Mhm.
And the I mean, part of what brought down the Jedi and what turned the Republic against them was a PR campaign that the Emperor, that Palpatine subtly helped along, that that used this kind of fan critique of the Jedi, and used that as one of the things that, and created a scandal in universe, the story of this
Mm.
scandal in universe that caused the public to turn against the Jedi and made them more accepting of the Emperor's heavy-handed approach to them later on.
Mm.
So yeah, that's it. So I mean, that's the sort of thing that these kinds of tie-ins can add to this. I mean, yes, you can if you're a very imaginative individual, you can come up with your own story of how the Jedi fell that might be better than what the original authors had. But let's be real here. Most people do not have that level of imagination, and so seeing those questions answered by later works, and it allows them to look at the what happened in the original trilogy or in the prequel trilogy in a new light.
Mm.
And
Yeah, that is
that's what
absolutely true.
I mean.
I mean,
That's
it is absolutely true that you're quite correct that for anybody who um, doesn't want to, or just as an alternative to what they have imagined, that that this sort of thing does very much, uh, offer an additional layer of depth. The I mean, there are parts of it where, frankly, like the utterly bizarre way in terms of the overall story as well as the backstory and so on of where Anakin was assigned to kill a bunch of defenseless children while the stormtroopers are the ones who went and defeated the Jedi is an utterly a choice I cannot fathom. I mean, it would have made wildly more sense to have Anakin hunt down and kill the Jedi. That he, being so powerful with the Force and so amazing, would be able to actually, defeat them in combat and thus kill them, thus being Darth Vader, the actual scary threat, as opposed to Darth Vader, the guy where the most challenging thing he was assigned was killing a bunch of defenseless children.
Yeah, I mean
So
that was. I mean, I have to wonder if I mean, I'm not defending every decision the prequels ever made. I mean,
right,
because the
and
prequels
I'm
are
not trying to back you into the corner of having to defend them. So I want to be clear. I don't mean that that this in some way invalidates anything that you said about them, because it doesn't. I'm sort of giving a caveat that, like, there are a few parts here where, I mean, I think if you take your average person on the street and ask them to come up with, okay, so when Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, what did he do? They would probably come up with, so who is it who kills the Jedi? Him or just a bunch of clone troopers? And what should he do? I think most people would come up with something better than, the Jedi are just all killed by the clone troopers, and in a pretty quick battle. It doesn't consist of very much, and Anakin Skywalker just he'll attack the softest targets there are, doing something that like literally anybody with no force powers could have done. I think the average person will come up with something better than that one particular aspect of that story. But that said, that's only one part of it, and for a lot of things, there's a lot of rich imagination that goes in there that I think you're right. The average person would not have nearly as much in the way of the sort of rich imaginative things that did go into the prequels, and the so I would say you're entirely correct there that it does offer a real richness that adds something. There is still the question of what do you do with the things that are kind of, they're the mistakes that you just straight up overlook because they're easily fixable anyway. Like the thing with Leia dying in childbirth, there was absolutely no reason for her to actually die in childbirth there, and so the Emperor could have just hidden her away and used his force powers to deceive Vader, and then she dies a while later. That part of it is when something is easy to solve, I think we all tend to be far more lenient about those sorts of errors simply because okay, they didn't fix it in one of any number of fairly obvious ways that you could just fix that kind of problem. So having said that, I do think the only place that, and the main thing that was about my video that you had taken issue with when I said that there isn't really such thing as canon. What I mean by that is that one of the so going back to our original discussion, we talked about how canon, the thing about canon, because it's a metaphor from canon within the church, that there's scripture which is canonical, and then there's stuff that's outside of canon. And the thing about canon was this was the scripture you could use during sacred liturgy, and that's the big clear distinction that there's scripture that is read during sacred liturgy, and this is used during sacred liturgy, and it is and works that are outside of it, like Saint Augustine wrote all sorts of great and brilliant things, but you don't use Saint Augustine during sacred liturgy. But the flip side to it that's kind of important is that there is an implied requirement that you use the canonical works during sacred liturgy. And in fact, within the Catholic Church, there is a specific ordering of the readings such that if you attend daily mass, you'll actually go through them all. People get a very abbreviated version because the 3-year cycle.
I think you talked about this in the previous video.
Yeah, I had to be brief, that that the other part though that if you actually attend daily mass, you'll get all of it, is the other thing that we need to that I think is important to consider when we say whether or not there's canon, in the sense that is there an obligation to take the prequels as part of the original trilogy?
I mean, it would certainly. Yeah, that's a really good. I think that's a really good question, because honestly, a lot of the obligation that is opposed is often. I mean, the obligations that are imposed from are sort of imposed from the top down by corporations. The corporations that own the IPs, they do, you see increasingly that a lot of them do, especially the ones that were run by people who came out of nerd culture, they increasingly care a lot more about canon.
Mm-hmm.
Although there are exceptions, the ones that come out of a kind of postmodern, that have this kind of postmodern view, like presumably Kathleen Kennedy, because I believe that's they actually are positively thumb their nose at the very idea of having this kind of standard in their art, and I believe that's why she I mean, going back to what you said earlier, why you couldn't fathom, I believe the reason why she might have done that, even with her franchise, was just a kind of, experimentation for the sake of experimentation. Oh, we're just going to try
Mm,
this. We're just going to break the rules and try this and see how it turns out. Um,
mm,
the kind of nilly sort of wheeling attitude that is the very opposite of this. There's a certain of this type of nerd who will obsess over canon lore details and
mm.
will act in a very shrill and accusatory way if you somehow contradict those details.
Mm.
It's the opposite extreme of that, where you just do not care and you are and you just want to do whatever you want.
Well, there's also an element to some degree, just having read some of the things that some of the people involved have said. They're not explicit, but I also get the feeling that in some cases there's sort of what amounts to like a straight up bullying that goes on, like a like, aha, now I control this thing that you love, and look at what I'm look at what I'm look watch me rip the arm off of your teddy bear.
Yeah, that's. I mean,
More or
that
less
is
directly,
the.
that like, now I'm doing this to you and you just have to take it. Um,
Yeah,
was to
that's
some
why.
degree part of the attitude.
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of malice, but I mean, our common friend Dave the Distributist actually made a Substack article on folk culture, and he talks a bit about the idea of an extended, a shared universe, and he
Mhm.
says that a lot of this has to do with a kind of vanity on the part of the creators, where they want to use they make these kinds of corporate decisions out of a kind of personal and political vanity. They want it, and not so much because they want to create good art.
Mm.
Because they don't, because postmodernists don't believe there is such a thing as good art.
No, they don't.
Because they reject the idea of objective universal standards as being parochial and kind of Western centric. Because
Mhm.
they'd say that different cultures have different standards of art, and therefore there's no objective standards that we can reach.
Mhm.
And any kind of objective standard, you can arguing for some kind of objective standard is an imposition of force, of an imposition of will onto
Mhm.
the thing. And so, going back to what I said earlier, about where does the obligation come from? Well, the obligatory force. I mean, if we're talking about, I mean, one of my arguments for canon was earlier just on the descriptive side and the interpretive side. You know how in order to similarly, in order to, just like how you would need to go to the church and to the tradition in order to interpret the Bible, you would need to go to the author of a work and the people who control that work in order to interpret, a work of fiction. But the but one of the things that but the thing that I find on the obligatory side is kind of hard to find that obligatory nature, because because you have these two forces of obligation, and neither of them are particularly strong as a moral authority compared to the church. One of them
Mhm.
is the force of the author's property rights. This is the sort of author's right that they have as a result of writing the work. If you own a piece of land, you can control what that land you can land, and you can control what goes on that land and what doesn't, within reason, of course. And you have that, and and that is your moral right as the landowner. And so the author of a work is similar to the owner of a land of a piece of land in that he controls he controls what's in his work, what is not in his work, how this is decided. He could decide that chapter 5 is not canon anymore. He can decide that this work of fan fiction is now canon. I've seen authors who are who find a work by a dedicated fan, and they are so infatuated with it that they decide, now that's canon
Hmm.
because I really like it. I mean the and that's actually something, and that's something that the church doesn't do, obviously.
Yes.
But because the church, for all its power, does not ultimately decide what's canon. God decides what's canon, and the church is just the God's representative on earth. And but the author is basically the god of his work, lowercase g, and he decides and so he decides what's in his work, and so he can take out what's in his on the canon. The problem with that, as you might say, is that while we might be obligated to respect him on the part of human law, as in we're not allowed to legally say that this is canon and this is non-canon, because it's ultimately the author who decides that. Human law uh, human law doesn't necessarily regulate what goes on in our heads and what goes
Hmm.
on in our private spheres. So long as we don't try to profit from our fan work, we can make all the fan fiction we want, and we can say whatever is canon. And in the realm of fan fiction is basically anarchy, and which is why you would probably find this kind of bullying that you suggested, which is the flip side of the obligatory, which is there are fandoms, and these fandoms operate as a sort of anarchical way, almost a kind of ultra democratic way, where different people within the fandom will sway the masses in a kind of to say to choose this interpretation or that interpretation, and oh, you can't do this, and oh, you cannot do that. And this is done mainly for reasons of know-how, and also some of these people do this out of malicious intent. They want to brag about how well they know the source material, or they are personally vain and can't admit that somebody else might have a better idea than them. But some of them do come at this from a place of good intentions, in that they don't want things that are untrue, which is called. There's a term on TV tropes called fanon.
I'm sorry,
Which is
called what?
fanon. It's
Fanon.
a
Oh, yes, yes.
it's a play on canon, and it's basically when a misconception among the fandom about a work becomes so widespread that it becomes so widespread that it doesn't and that newcomers who enter into these fandoms might be tricked into thinking that this is canon, and
Mm.
when it is not actually canon, and so they'll be confused and they'll start acting as though it is. And usually, why the reason why this is looked down upon is because number one, if you are espousing canon as if it's canon, then that shows that you haven't actually read the work and you don't really know what you're talking about, and you're just going around saying foolish things while thinking yourself to be knowledgeable,
Mm.
which is always looked down upon, no matter the context. even if
Yes, very
something
true.
even something as trivial as pop media knowledge, pop culture knowledge, that kind of attitude is looked down upon. And also, people will use the presence of fanon in a work of fan fiction as a sort of sniff test to see sort of a shorthand to know if the author is actually a good writer.
Mm,
Because if the author did the research and actually knows the source material and before he wrote the story, then that shows that there's a level of intelligence behind it. Whereas if
mhm,
the author includes a ton of fanon in the work and treats it as canon, then you know that the author didn't actually read the original work, or if he did, he's widely misremembering what was actually written, and
mm,
he's just writing based on other fan fiction stories he's read, and the highly derivative nature of the work is going to be low quality, and so
mm,
those are some of the better reasons why you would see the rise of these kinds of you know, some members of the fandom might take it upon themselves to police people in this sort of way. And I think, in a sense, I think this is, I think if I may, I'd like to transition from this to an aspect that you said. You were talking about folk culture, sort of the kind of folk tales that existed prior to the rise of copyright,
mhm,
and the idea of the author. You had different towns had different tales about what Hercules did,
mhm,
and you tried to say that, oh, this is just like how there are different versions of Spider-Man in comic books or in video games and so on. But that's not exactly the case because, I mean, in folk culture, while yes, you did have folk culture had this kind of localized feel to it, where it was the people of this community had these stories, and the people of that community had these stories. But with the rise of the idea of the author and this kind of international market that we see in modern society, we see that these kinds of local communities don't have these storytelling. I mean, I'm talking to you, and you're probably in another state. You're in another state from where I am, and yet we can talk about the same Star Wars stories. And the reason we can do that is because Disney has international reach. And so it's not actually the case that I have my Star Wars and you have your Star Wars, and your community has their own stories about Luke Skywalker and my community has mine. We all have the same story. And what unites us as a community is the fact that we have this corporate IP of Star Wars.
Well,
Um,
even there's actually a curious yes and no, because, for example, you may have the DVDs of, well, I mean, here's the funny thing. I don't know what DVDs you may or may not have of Star Wars, but
I
it would be
actually
very.
have I actually have the VHS. That's how I watched it.
Ah, okay. Well, here's the thing. Like, you have the VHS, I have the DVDs. The ones that were the unedited ones that were released. So in both of our media, Han shot first. Someone else, however, may have a copy wherein Han cold-bloodedly executed a man incapable of hurting him.
Yes, you gave that example in the story.
Yeah. So,
I
in
remember.
ours, in the versions we have, Han defended himself from a clear and present danger, and in the version someone else has, Han, executed this man who was clearly posing no threat to him. Now, to push it even more, though, or then again, now I don't know whether or not you own any of the DVDs to the sequel trilogy. I'm sorry, the sequel trilogy, and I know that I certainly don't.
I
And
don't.
so, And so, well, somebody else might. And so, in their world, when they talk about Star Wars, they may talk about the sequel, how the sequel trilogy happened, and how, in one movie the Force didn't awaken, and in the next there's um, the Jedi are continuing, and in the last one, what was it? That was the title about the last
I
one.
think it was called The Rise of Skywalker,
Right, thank you.
where
Yes, in the final movie,
where
Skywalker didn't rise, and
yeah,
so
yeah. In fact, what happened was Ray Palpatine decided to steal Skywalker's name
right,
for
yeah,
himself.
and so I mean, I find it hilarious that in literally all three, the two movies are titled for what did not happen in them. But anyway, the leaving that out of account, somebody may like these movies somewhere, and they would have these DVDs and they would take them out and they would show them. And when they talk to their friends about this, they will talk about what happens in these. Whereas over here, amongst the people I'm ever going to talk to, we won't. I mean, other than talking about how bad they were, um, we won't talk about them. And we certainly won't talk about them in the same sort of way. But a much, much better example is when you get to things like comic book characters. So let me ask you this question. What was Peter Parker bitten by?
Yeah, a spider that was, a spider, and I think you mentioned before in the older comics it was a radioactive spider, while in newer comics it's a biologically engineered spider.
Yes. And so the answer is, well, so to put in the same sort of way that it was, what happened to Heracles when he died? And well, it's going to depend on what city you're in and, who you ask. In like manner, what was Peter Parker bitten by? Well, it's going to depend on who you ask. It's going to depend on which comics you read. It's much more complex than that, though, because not only are there a collection of comics that have, as well as a collection of rebooted comics. Now, you can also get further into.
At this point, the comics the reboots have been rebooted, and those reboots have been rebooted. Who knows what?
Right.
I
Yeah, what do you want to count Spider-Man 2099 with Miguel O'Hara as? And, and so on. But also, there are a whole collection of video games in which, for example, there's some interesting stories in the characterization of Spider-Man and Black Cat, for example. And one of my favorite Spider-Man games, which is it was the one based on the movie with Dr. Octopus, in which the video game had far more characters and much better story than the movie did. And so, it had some of the same plot points with Dr. Octopus as the movie, sort of.
I'm not
I've only played
I'm just
2 or 3 Spider-Man games, actually. And I know there are a whole
I'm
bunch,
not
but
a big
again,
yeah.
the point
Again,
here
what?
being,
Sorry.
but again, these have different stories about Spider-Man with different characterization than do you find in the comics. Then you can go to the various cartoon incarnations of Spider-Man, like that utterly, truly bizarre one from the 1970s where Spider-Man was voiced like he was 50 years old. And the animation was reused so incredibly. They're astonishingly bad, actually. I mean, I remember as an adult actually seeing some of them. It was one of those things. If a friend had some there, put them on, and I sort of, they were so terrible. I sort of temporarily lost the will to live and couldn't even get out of the chair to start watching the things.
Okay. Oh, your point.
The point being, this had a different characterization of Spider-Man, again, than you find in the comics, than you find in the books. Then there are a collection of other things where you find Spider-Man in, I remember in like around the year 2000, 2001, there was a CGI Spider-Man, like a cel-shaded CGI Spider-Man, that was only like 1 season long. I really enjoyed that particular characterization, which gets to how it was just kind of a different characterization of Spider-Man from a lot of other stuff. And again, there have been other things, and they're all sorts of movies and so on. I mean, Spider-Man's had, what, a dozen origin stories, 24, if you include all the video games and so on.
Every superhero has had at least 3 origin stories at this point, barring that. At least if you, I think the number of origin stories a character has are I don't have the exact numbers, but on average there's about at least one per generation, because they're trying to update it to fit in with the times.
Yes, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Yeah, it's all over the place, but I think that's a good generalization, yes. And so my point is, when you put all of this stuff together, what is Spider-Man like? At this point, it's sort of pick which particular thing. And there's absolutely nothing illegitimate about saying, you know what, I really enjoyed the Spider-Man that was in, this particular PlayStation game. I thought, like, the way they wrote him, the characters, his relationships, like, this is my favorite Spider-Man. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is at this point essentially impossible to describe Spider-Man without qualifying which version of him you're talking about. And so I think Spider-Man is, Superman's up there too. Spider-Man may be the best example of that, just because he has appeared in so many shows, in so many versions, and comic books and video games and so on. So just so many versions, that it's probably the best example of that phenomenon, that the story has been told and retold and rebooted again, as you said, and so on, and just redone in completely different media. That it is very much the case that you cannot put together any any sort of reconciled accounting of all of these things. That you simply have to, for at least Spider-Man, pick which version you're talking about. In much the same way that if you want to talk about Heracles, you kind of have to pick, well, which city's stories do you want to talk about? So that's probably the where I would say that, like, that's the most extreme example. But there are a fair number of things like that where, you want to talk about Get Smart. Are you talking about the new movie with the different characters, or you're talking about the original, the original one? And they each have their merits, and they're very different stories. And and on, like with the passion for reboots that we've seen. Which Batman origin story would you like? That's right. Batman's another one.
Yeah. But what I was saying is, I mean, one of the downsides of this is, it's sort of a similar confusion. To go back to the church analogy, it's a similar confusion to the kind that you see within Protestantism. For example, you might have one printing of the Bible that says X, and one printing of the Bible that says Y, and or some slightly different version of X, and and you have and what ends up happening is that there are these irreconcilable theological disagreements that occur within these churches, that ends with them splitting off and going off into other directions, and the entire community and these communities keep fracturing again and again and again. And I think what a lot of people who complain about, the defilement of canon by these postmodernists, who, by the way, make rather similar arguments to you. I mean, I'm not saying that you're a postmodernist. You're definitely not. But a lot of them do make similar arguments to you. Oh, it's, you can always just enjoy it yourself. You can always, there isn't really a thing called canon. What is that anyway? And the response that you get from, say, I mean, what's a YouTuber that the only one, there was this guy named Critical Drinker, who's a YouTuber who reviews movies from a kind of classical liberal anti-SJW type of position. And his argument for canon is that if we don't have a clear understanding of canon, then what will happen is I'll come to you talking about Spider-Man, and you'll come to me talking about Spider-Man, but we won't be talking about the same thing. We'll be talking about completely different things, and it'll end up with confusion, and there's not going to be, and that's the end of any kind of commonality between us because
Yes.
we're at this point we're not even the words that we're using aren't don't even have the same definition. That's basically the end of these kinds of phantoms.
Mhm.
And and I think that might actually be the reason why that whether this is planned or this is planned on their part or is just a coincidence. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that these postmodernists are by defiling canon, by rejecting the idea of canon, are basically undermining any kind of power that these kinds of nerd communities might have.
Mhm.
Uh, you know what I mean?
I
Because
do.
they're
And
fracturing like that.
by the way, let me clarify that I believe entirely that an author should attempt to be consistent. And where you have multiple authors, they should attempt to be consistent such that you actually do have one consistent idea. And I actually, um, the I would go so far as to say that I think that it is a vastly better idea to tell new stories about new characters than to reboot an existing thing and tell alternative stories about the same character. So in terms of what would I recommend to an author, I would very, very strongly recommend to an author, to a group of authors, being as consistent as possible, enabling the existence of something like canon. It wholly makes things better, and it has, as you say, the very negative effects of disuniting people if you keep telling contradictory stories. So, in my own, in the murder mysteries that I'm writing, I try very hard to be consistent with things. I mean, murder mysteries tend, by their nature, to be very episodic. Anyhow, that the detective keeps on coming into the life of different people, and so it's it is a place where it is much easier to be consistent, simply because with the having a mostly new cast of characters each time, because if nothing else, you can't have the same person dying over and over again. You only, for the most part, you only get to die once, and so so it's kind of easier to follow through with in my own case. But I mean, certainly in the novels that I write, I very much try to do that because I think it is a thing, for the reasons you outlined, very much worth doing. That moreover, that there is a that the problem that comes about um, is that you have, when you contradict your previous stories, what you're really doing is you are really breaking the one off from the other. You're making it where you have to pick or choose which one of these two stories that I've claimed are related to each other but really aren't are you going to actually think of as the story. And it has, exactly as you say, it fractures a community. It makes it, if I retell you the same story five different ways, if I tell the same story five different ways to five different people, it ceases to be possible, as you say, for these people to really talk to each other because they could only ever talk past each other. And that's why I say that in that circumstance where this has already happened, that, when you stand here in the year of our Lord 2021, and there are 35 different versions of Spider-Man, we stand here in the wreckage of people having taken an idea and sort of broken it and rebroken it and broken it some more. What do we do as we sort of stand in the rubble? And to some degree, what my video is about is how you look around and you pick up one of the pieces and then you tell people, hey, here's this piece. Why don't you look at it too, and maybe we can talk about this piece together? And so what I was recommending is primarily a way of of how do you deal with being in that wreckage where we don't have very much culture in common, and the people who have been creating what should be our common culture have largely been highly irresponsible with it. Because I think it's very fair to characterize what was done in Star Wars episodes 7, 8, and 9 as being simply irresponsible. Star Wars 4, 5, and 6 were good and meaningful stories that conveyed meaning and truth about the world in a way that Star Wars episodes 7, 8, and 9 only conveyed the truth, if that a fool and his money are soon parted. And the so I think what they did was deeply irresponsible, and the question we're left with was, since the people who were supposed to have done this better didn't, then how should we do? What's the best we can do in the aftermath of these people having been irresponsible? Do you go the route that our friend Dave the Distributor seems like he often goes in of, we're just not going to watch any movies and not have anything whatever to do with it, and just sort of mourn that there once was a thing called Star Wars, but it has been taken from us, and so we must now be silent about it. I don't want to put words into Dave's mouth, by the way.
Well, I mean,
I'm not quoting him. I'm just giving my sense of the things he said lately.
Well, I mean, I guess I do get that vibe from him sometimes. Although what he seems to want to do is, did you read his Substack, his Substack article on folk culture?
No, it's actually something I'm curious about, but I don't actually know what Substack is.
It's a place where you can post blogs. A lot of journalists are using that nowadays, and one of the things that wait, hold on a second. Is that? All right, yeah, okay. There was just somebody open the door. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. So
his Substack.
Yeah, his Substack. Okay. So Dave wrote a Substack called Folk Culture and the Extended Universe. He recently posted a video reading of it on his channel too, and in that he talks about how his theory is that the reason why there are all this dearth of creativity is because of the destruction of folkways, the destruction of folk culture, and because of this destruction of folk culture, everything around us seems fake and artificial. And so if we want to have something that is better, better art, we would need to sort of re-engineer the conditions under which folk culture is formed. And he gives a sort of an outline in his idea of how one could sort of artificially re-engineer the kind of folk culture under which under which stories like Cinderella or Hansel and Gretel were created. And if you think that those stories don't have power, Walt Disney, the company, actually made its fortune off of essentially copywriting these previously previously public domain type of material. So it's not as though these stories don't have this kind of deeper meaning that later stories don't just kind of, they just seem to lack.
Well, I will add one thing. They're actually, there are kind of a few separate interesting things. One of which is that if you think about the original folk version of this, these were just stories that were written down. And the thing that happened with Walt Disney was they then spent a ton of money to create a visually spectacular version of them. And this is a thing that goes on in a lot of cases where one thing that a place where I think a lot of people go wrong in terms of trying to recreate the culture, as the culture's dying off, to recreate a vibrant culture, amongst the wreck and ruin, is that they tend to think of the things that they grew up with, things like television shows and movies, and they forget how inordinately expensive these things are. How a television show is the work of anywhere from about 30 to 100 people, and a movie is the work of anywhere from small movies will be the work of a few dozen people, larger movies the work of several hundred people. And that in order to pay for that sort of thing, you need truly enormous audiences, paying a lot of money. And that these things are, especially if you're in the minority, extremely difficult. And that our forebears who had this folk culture largely made do with wildly cheaper things, like one person writing stories down in text, and you buy it in text. And maybe, there's somebody who draws a few pictures with it. So that's one thing that I think is very important to bear in mind, is that when you don't have that many people and you don't have astonishing amounts of money, that one of the things people are going to need to content themselves with to find good stories are stories that can be told cheaply. So as much as it's not exactly great to say we won't be able to make $100 million movies without there being a giant number of us, I think there's an element of that needs to be, in terms of simple pragmatism, a little bit of a return to, if we want good stuff, it's going to have to be cheap, because for the simple reason that you need astonishingly large numbers of people to make really expensive stuff. And just the other quick thing, though, about that is I do want to say, too, that there's another element in the modern context that when you have postmodern people, I've written about this, I really need to make a video about this, but that the hero, you cannot, modern people can't tell a heroic story, or at least postmodern people cannot tell a heroic story, for the simple reason that they cannot conceive of heroism, because when all you have is the imposition of wills, the hero makes precisely no sense, because to go and do things for other people would be simply to subordinate yourself to them, which by subordinating yourself to them in a postmodern context, all that's happening is their will is replacing yours, and so you're being erased for their sake, being destroyed as they supplant you, and you become nothing but an extension of them.
If you look at postmodern stories, a lot of them amount, and a lot of postmodern superhero comics basically amount to personal or political vanity projects that the author writes in the hope of either getting an award or getting an adaptation into a comic book, or into a movie or a television show or a video game that will probably make more money than the comic book. So,
sure, but what I mean is a postmodern. Really sorry. It's not an accident that the postmodern stories are all essentially some guy deciding, in practice, if he wants to be mostly worthless or completely worthless. The mostly worthless option being the heroic option, but it largely it always consists basically of some guy who decides to be what is convenient to others, roughly speaking, because he feels like it, because he gets something out of it. Probably the most modern portion of their faux heroic stories are where somebody thanks the hero and the hero tells him, "Don't thank me. I did it for myself, not for you." And that my point there is that it's not that postmoderns even want to wreck things, that they that they simply want to destroy, like the toddler who wants to knock down the stack of bricks that he can't build up. It's that the postmodern literally cannot recognize a heroic story as heroic. It's not that he sees the heroic story and wants to destroy something that's good. It's that the heroic story literally doesn't make any sense to him. He has degenerated so far that he doesn't even recognize
Oh
what a
yeah,
heroic story is. And so, like look at look at Rey. Like, why does she do the stuff that she does? I mean, she's got no reason. She's not doing it to be heroic. She's helping her friends because she wants her friends. So, it's sort of a selfish action, approximately.
I don't. I mean, it does. I mean, it's kind of a. I mean, there's this vague notion that what she's trying to do is find herself.
Well, right.
Kind of like how someone who is a modern day progressive who is looking for authenticity and trying to find themselves, so they go to some third world country, right?
Yeah, no, oh, that amazing, astonishingly hilarious scene where Rey walks into the lair of ultimate evil, and it's this cozy, womb-like, comfortable, soft place. I mean, just the sheer ineptitude of going into the heart of darkness, into the focal point of all evil, and it's just kind of dimly lit and non-threatening. And I mean, and in case you thought maybe there was a hint of threat, she has a voiceover to tell you that it wasn't threatening.
Yeah, I've never seen. I actually have never seen. I don't comment on the sequels because I've only seen the first movie. I sort of stopped seeing it after the first movie.
Oh, I knew the first movie was going to be terrible, so I didn't see it. And I didn't see the second movie because I also knew it was going to be terrible. And then a friend who came over to visit made me see it because he wanted to see my reaction. And it took about 4.5 hours to get through because I kept pausing it saying, "What?"
Yeah,
what?
The first movie is kind of I mean, the first movie is sort of a retelling of Episode 4, except Han Solo is in the place of Obi-Wan, and Luke is a Mary Sue in a woman.
Yes, and really... instead of trying to destroy the main threat against the Empire, the rebellion that's been ongoing for a while, in this case, they stop attacking the Republic to go back and annihilate a planet within their own star system on which there's like a tiny handful of completely inconsequential people because they found them. I mean, it's basically like, imagine if in World War II, after dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, instead of dropping the second bomb on Nagasaki, instead they dropped the bomb on some tiny little town in Ohio because they heard there are like 3 samurai there who found a map to a legendary samurai. That's basically what turning Starkiller Base around and hightailing it away from the place they were invading to attacking a star system in their own territory is the equivalent of.
I mean,
I'm slightly understating it, but
I mean, nothing about the order. Nothing about the resistance versus the order conflict makes any sense. But I don't want to dwell on that.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to get going in a minute, so I apologize for derailing us there.
I mean, it's fine, but what I really wanted to get down on, I mean, before we, what I really wanted to drill down into is the kind of canon as this unifier, and because back in the days of ancient Greece, each town had its own stories of Hercules, and that was the way of telling stories of that town, and that was part of that town's identity. Part of that town's identity, that community's identity, was the stories the members of that community would tell each other. And and now that we have entered into modernity, we have this sort of there are these internet communities where and you're starting to see and you are and there and in that kind of modernity, and for the longest time, the stories that people told were the stories that individual authors and later large corporations wanted to tell, and that was canon, and that united all of us who liked those stories. And now, what you're seeing with the internet and with postmodernism is the breakdown of this giant mono community into internet tribes, except they're not confined to any kind of space and time, so they're just sort of all over the place.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, the sort of the one large shared culture thing is, I mean, there's an element in which it was to some degree um, a technological artifact that in the early days of technology, when the technology was still really expensive and not many people had it, the early days of television when there were 3 television stations, and the early days of movies where, I mean, there were more movies made in the early days, but at the same time, it was expensive, and there were only so many studios, and so I mean, there's still plenty of movies that a lot of people had seen, plenty of movies that only some people had seen. And I want to say it's probably like the 1970s, the early 1980s was really kind of like the heyday of television as a unifying culture. The most watched television episode of all time was the MASH finale, which had like something like 110, 120 million people watching it. Something kind of crazy to think of, and it's really kind of fascinating if you look at television now. But as of I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, when I looked it up, The Big Bang Theory was getting somewhere between 10 and 20 million people an episode watching it, and that was the most watched television show out of any of them. And in in approximately like 1980, if you got only 20 million people watching you, you were an abject failure as a television show. And so, I mean, a lot of that sort of unifying culture is I think a lot of it will end up being something of a historical happenstance about like television and people watching the same television shows. And to some degree too, Star Wars was a bit unusual in that Star Wars was just something, the originals were something really truly special. There was and especially in the context of when they were made, that you had the 1970s was a very sort of nihilistic time in American culture. It's really kind of fascinating. I was on a kick for a while of watching historical movies out of historical interest, and you start the 1970s, which is well known for movies like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, or Saturday Night Fever. The one with John Travolta dancing to the Bee Gees song, and as they walk down, like a lot of like the real classics. But when you watch these movies, they're really, really actually quite nihilistic. It's the same time you're getting the during the major crime waves, you're getting the a lot of like the Dirty Harry movies, the cops who just stop following the law and start taking out bad guys any way they can, and which is not really a message of hope at all. It still had a great darkness to it, because it was these figures who were not particularly just, and who certainly, the people who enforced the law, who didn't follow the law, were, like, at this point basically the only hope, which is a very sort of dark thing. And in that context, in the late 1970s, you have Star Wars coming out, which is this, which once again had the sort of, heroism that you would see in, like, your classic westerns, that had, the great sort of, fight against evil that you would see in the World War II movies that were made so heavily in the 1950s and the 1960s. It drew from a lot of these things, and incorporated in, sort of this decade of sort of bleak despair that largely made stuff that no one wants to remember. This sort of, shining and optimistic thing with a return to all sorts of classical virtues. And so Star Wars was, I think, to some degree, just a very sort of special thing that was an artifact of its time in a way. It was part of why it was so much bigger a movie than most had been up to that point. And so the unified aspect, I think, partially came about because it was so different from the things around it, and it was creative in a number of ways, and just a lot of things came together, so that I do think it's important to be realistic in terms of how unified the culture can be, that there weren't other things taking that same place, that Star Wars was something of a special phenomenon, and the way that such an incredibly large number of people could talk about Star Wars was unusual. In that, and then later on, as you have, you have all sorts of different things that come about, but none of them are as special. So you don't have, so like, you get to things like Babylon 5, which, granted, is it's not as good as Star Wars by any means. And so, you have some fans of it. You have Star Trek and the various Star Trek incarnations, and there's a way it really captured the imagination of a generation. I don't know the degree. There hasn't been good Star Wars in a long time. I'm sorry, good Star Trek in a long time, and even where there was the good Star Trek, the best Star Trek being the original, and then the Next Generation, about 1 out of every 4 episodes was actually why you watched the show. 3 out of 4 being you kind of got through them hoping for better. And so, I think part of it is it's not really the natural, the normal state of fallen humanity to have as much of a shared culture there in terms of shared popular culture. It is fairly natural to have the Bible as a shared referent. That went on for, a good, well over 1,000 years, that you could expect other people within Christian culture to have read the Bible, and you could make biblical references and expect people to actually get them and understand them, and so on. And if you hang out in the right places, you can still do that. So I think, in short, I see why the thing is desirable, and I certainly enjoyed it while it happened, but I don't think that popular culture being a shared culture is the natural state of fallen humanity.
Well,
not to end on a downer, but
one of the, I guess if you want to have an more uplifting idea, I might want to ask this question. So you would say that I want to ask you a couple of questions before we wrap things up. So, do you think that during this time where there was greater unity, do you think that back then there was a canon fiction, or do you think that was just an illusion created by sort of the technology at the time, or did the technology actually create, or did the technology actually create that unity?
I want to say that actually, to some degree, the that it wasn't the technology of the time that created the appearance of canon, but rather the relative novelty of the things themselves. Did that George Lucas, in writing the trilogy, George Lucas, I know it's debated whether or not he really had the plot to all three movies before he wrote the script to the first one, but it is, at least to my mind, plausible because the three of them fit with each other so very well. And even if he didn't, he wrote in a manner that was consistent. And then after you have Return of the Jedi, you don't have Star Wars again for a fairly long time. And again, you still have George Lucas, who was at least trying to be consistent, even if he had changed and was not writing the same sort of things at that point. So that I want to say, to some degree, the appearance of canon was, partially intentional in that some people, at least, and George Lucas certainly at first, was trying to do a good job. He was trying to be consistent. So that's one part of it. And then another part of it is he hadn't had time to do things like come out with the very special, releases, the very special edits of Star Wars. And so, and even apart from that, like, he hadn't had time. So some of it was that during this time frame that you don't have so, like, during that time frame, there just isn't enough time for it to degenerate too far. Because, like, I mean, one of the things, if you go back and look at popular culture references in older stuff, like, I really love mystery novels, especially English mystery novels from like the 1920s and 30s, the golden age of detective fiction, as it's often called. And you'll see popular culture references in these things, but popular culture references have a very strong tendency to be to things that came out in the last few years before the thing was written. Books that came out just a few years before the thing was written. And the and they're often esoteric, and you often sort of get the feeling they're a little esoteric because there's often a bit of sort of self-defining of what's going on, giving you enough context that if you hadn't read the original, you'll get the reference. So it's a so I mean, and I bring that up because I think that if you look at older stuff, and their the tendency to go for popular culture, it tends to be very recent stuff that they have reason to think there's a good reason a lot of people will have seen because it was so very recent and it was very popular just a year ago, sort of thing. You don't have you don't have nearly the same sort of everybody referring to stuff from 20 or 30 years ago nearly as much. Obvious exception in detective fiction being Sherlock Holmes, that you will have references to Sherlock Holmes all throughout for the next 100 years, but that's partially in the same way that you'll have references to Shakespeare in things that have absolutely that are not at all in the same genre as Shakespeare. So I think there's that, and unfortunately, I do have to get going. I've got a hungry child who's pleading with me for animal crackers. But I do want to add one more thing, if I may, which is that I think the alternative, by the way, to having that shared culture is to find great stories and then share them with your friends. So I do want to end on that hopeful note that there is, that I don't mean that things are bleak without that sort of shared canon that people largely aren't creating anymore, but that we're in that position that people have been in throughout the ages of finding good things, finding good friends to share them with, and sharing those good things with your friends.
All right then. I think that's it. I think that's a good place to end this conversation, and I really hope that you have a wonderful day. You're for it. I think that I'm going to stay on a little bit longer and look at the chat, you're free to go back to take care of your family if you need to.
Yep. Yeah, I have to go provide some animal crackers as soon as possible.
All right.
Well,
You have a
thank you
great
so much
day.
for having me on.
All right. Yeah. Ave
Thank you.
Maria, friend.
God bless you, William. Bye.
All right. So I'm going to just go over use these last few minutes to go over the chat like I always do and see what it here. Dark Killoon says play Revenge of the Sith or Battlefront 2, playing Anakin slaughtering Jedi. If I ever decide that I want to play video games again, which I don't see myself doing, I'll give it a watch. Computing the Soul, my friend Elliot says, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith is one big radicalization tale. Well, I didn't get to bring this up earlier, but Star Wars: The Clone Wars is Star Wars: The Clone Wars. This animated series does give a lot of. Sorry about that in the background. Star Wars: The Clone Wars does give a lot of detail to the fall of Anakin. You see the different moments, and in each moment where Anakin falls and shows his dark side, it's usually one of two things. Either he's allowing his passions to get the better of him, usually his anger, because he's angered by something related to his past, like, or maybe because another man is moving in on Padme and he doesn't like that, or he's being very pragmatic. You know, he stabs the villain to save the ship, or he tortures a man to get him to reveal information to help him save his friends. You know, things like that. It's these things that add up every time Anakin does something morally corrupt does something immoral for the benefit of the cause, or to save his friends, or whenever he lets his anger get the better of him. Every time he inches closer to that line, and eventually he reaches the place of no return, like in Revenge of the Sith. And in that case, he's just already gone. I think another thing that I'd like to mention about this is that Anakin with Miss Windu. Um, I mean, I would disagree with Christopher's reading of that scene. Anakin didn't want Mace Windu to kill Palpatine because at that point he was already swayed by Palpatine's temptations and wanted to learn more. Wanted to learn more from Palpatine on how he could save his wife from the death that he saw in a vision. And honestly, the vision ended up being a result of his own actions, the future he foresaw, and he ended up causing with his own hands. So that's that. Let's see. So so my friend, this guy ZS says, "What about video games with multiple endings or choices?" Those types of things, you can either have one, or if you want to talk about canon, there are one of two options you can go here. The first is the multiple universe route. I've seen video games like Fate Stay Night, where you would have multiple endings, and they are all canon, including the bad endings. So Fate Stay Night has five normal endings and 40 bad endings. And they're all declared canon by the author Kanoko Nasu, and they basically all are just not, and what do I call it? So they all basically take place within the multiverse because multiple parallel worlds are a thing in that story. The other side of this, the other option for multiple endings, is you have a canon ending where you would have a game that has multiple endings, but one of those endings leads to the next game of the series. And that get the sequels series. Um, I can't really think of any games off the top of my head that are like that, so I'm going to go on. Uh, Last one, yo-based postmodernist undermining nerds. Well, it's basically the left eating the previous generation of the left. That's what happened. That's what's happening. You know, the Distributist actually made a great video on this about nerd culture, in which he talked about how the nerds were part of the progressive coalition. And then the progressives decided that they didn't need straight white men in the movement anymore, playing such a prominent role, and so they nerds no longer have protected status by virtue of being nerds. They are now just a target unless they turn trans, in which case they're not a target anymore. All right. So I'm going to sign off here. God bless everybody. Ave Maria. And I hope you had a wonderful day.